Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. We are just going to take about 30 seconds to let folks join the webinar. Thank you all for joining us today. Again, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to take a little bit more time to let folks join the webinar. Thanks again for joining us today. We have a great panel set up for you all as part of our Racial Justice in the Law series. All right, I'll go ahead and start. So again, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gabriella. I am co-chair of the Los Angeles chapter of the ACS, American Constitution Society lawyer chapters. Again, welcome. Thank you to each of you for joining us today. ACS Los Angeles is committed to challenging and disrupting systems of oppression by launching this series of discussions focused on unpacking and understanding systemic racism within the context of various areas of the law, as well as sharing recommendations in law and policy that you all can use to uplift in the movement for equity and justice. We've already had a panel on the criminal legal system and on voting rights, and today we're going to be focused on education justice. Education should be the most powerful force in the world by instilling knowledge, building competence, and breaking down barriers to opportunity. For kids, education is often the key to open the door to a better life for themselves and their families and pursue their dreams. However, school systems have been complicit in perpetuating systemic racism through the criminalization and marginalization of Black, Indigenous, Latinx, immigrant, and other children of color through policies and practices ranging from discriminatory discipline, inequitable school funding, English-only initiatives, euro-centric curriculum, tracking and investing in law enforcement over the arts, health services, and social emotional supports. Today's discussion will address systemic racism within the context of our education system, as well as offer tools and approaches that seek to dismantle it. First, I'd like to take a moment to thank our co-sponsors, the Mexican American Bar Association and the ACS lawyer chapters of Minneapolis, the Bay Area, San Diego, Chicago, Washington, DC, and Austin. If you're joining us today, you can also receive California CLE credit. You can email ACS directly at lcemails@acslaw.org. We'll also drop in that email into the chat so that everybody has it. We'll also have a Q&A section around with 10 to 15 minutes left of our conversation. And please use the Q&A box to drop in any questions that you may have. I would now like to introduce our esteemed panelists and moderator. In the interest of keeping things brief, though, we invite you to look them up and Google them to see all about the amazing things that they've accomplished already in their careers. So our moderator today is Professor Jody Armour. He is the Roy P. Crocker Professor of Law at the University of Southern California. Professor Armour has recently released a book on his own unique critical race theory, entitled N*GGA Theory, Race, Language, Unequal Justice, and the Law. We'll also drop a link to purchase that book in the chat as well and encourage you all to get that. Andrew Harrison is a civil rights attorney and writer based in Austin, Texas. He is the Education Justice Project Director of Texas Appleseed, where he engages in public policy, advocacy, and works with community groups to diminish the presence and influence of school police across the state of Texas. He is also the secretary of the board of Learn Together, Live Together, a school integration nonprofit in Washington, D.C. Our next panelist is Amir Whitaker. He is an educator, writer, musician, and policy counsel with the ACLU of Southern California. In 2014, Amir started Project Knucklehead to inspire vulnerable youth and help them reach their potential through education, music, and arts programs. He is also the board chair of the Arts for Incarcerated Youth Network, a collaborative of a dozen organizations providing art programming to youth throughout LA County. And then we have Krithika Santhanam. She's a staff attorney for Advancement Project National Office, working with the Justice Project and ending the schoolhouse to jailhouse track program. Krithika previously served as the Director of Youth Development at Legacy LA, a grassroots community-based nonprofit serving youth and families in East LA. While there, she helped create the organization's youth leadership program, which provides critical race theory workshops, civic engagement opportunities, and community organizing training aimed at catalyzing youth to become advocates for their community. So welcome to all of our panelists and our moderator. I will hand it off to Professor Armour now. Thank you.
All right, it's a real pleasure to be here again. We're in the third leg of our series and considering the impact of racism on all kinds of institutions in America. We looked at the criminal justice system already. We looked at voting, and now we're going to look at education. Of course, all of these issues form a seamless web. They're interconnected. For example, when you think about the criminal justice system, when I lost my old man, my dad, and my 7 siblings and I lost our dad to the criminal justice system, 22 to 55 for possession and sale of marijuana, we went from a middle-class existence to crumbs and roaches and rats. And that meant also we went to crumbling schools. We went from a good school system to crumbling schools. And most of the people I wound up with in those circumstances, in those conditions, did not go on to higher education, did not go on to college or graduate school as I did. They got caught up in the criminal justice system, as I surely would have, but for the intervention of 2 Great Society programs focused on education, Upward Bound and A Better Chance. A Better Chance takes kids out of inner city areas and puts them in boarding schools where they have a better chance of going on to college, right? But for that, surely I have a felony record along with a lot of guys I was running with at the time. So education, criminal justice, voting, all interconnected. And we're going to get to talk about the education part, especially today. When we were talking about voting, we had a question, folks, and maybe this will be one that you can consider in the background for this discussion as well. In voting, we were wondering if voting mattered. Right? We saw here in California, the bluest state in the union, promises made by legislators in Sacramento about criminal justice reform while people were out in the streets. When they got out of the streets, were no longer in the streets, they let all those reforms die. They let those bills die. So, you know, a lot of the protesters can say, what difference did it make casting those votes and getting those people in office? By the same token, what difference does education really make? I'm going to ask that, can it really improve our mobility? Is it the ladder to social mobility today? I had a kid in Crenshaw High School right around the corner from me here come to me in 2005-06 and say, Professor Armour, you've been preaching to us about education, Horatio Alger, the educational means to the legitimate American dream. The legitimate means to that American dream is education. Our high school just lost its accreditation. So now our diploma is worth toilet paper in the admissions process because it's coming from an unaccredited high school. So we did everything we were supposed to do, play by the rules, kept our nose to grindstone, and look at where we are. Education seemed to them like a cruel hoax. Right, at that moment, the connection between education and the American dream. So I want that, will education really get us free? Is kind of one of the questions I'm going to pose. And so I'm going to start with these terrific questions that the folks at ACS, American Constitution Society, oh my goodness, I'm so glad that they're doing the work that they're doing. Where were we before they existed? There was just a vacuum, right? Nature abhors a vacuum, and there was a lot to abhor before ACS came along. But I'm going to start with Andrew Hairston with a question to you, Andrew.
Yes,
how do you see systemic racism show up in our education system? And as the director of the Education Justice Project at Texas Appleseed, what does educational or education justice mean to you and to your work?
Yeah, I thank you for the question. And I really just want to contextualize it in this moment of 2020, where we have seen the fissures that have been building over the past 244 years in the United States and the 400 plus years that enslaved Black people have been on these shores really crack, right? And the public consciousness galvanize around that, both with the coronavirus pandemic and with the anti-Black police violence that we're registering every week at this point. So systemic racism plays into education in that you have the school to prison pipeline that is alive and well. This really sophisticated system where laws and policies enacted by local, state, and federal government actors push young people, historically underserved young people, Black and brown children, LGBTQ young people, kids with disabilities, into contact with the criminal legal system for age-appropriate behavior on their school campuses. And it can start as early as middle school, elementary school in the most heinous cases. And then you have this legacy of racism, thinking about child slavery and the prohibition on literacy for enslaved folks, thinking about Jim Crow and the state-sanctioned segregation of public accommodations, and everything, and even Brown v. Board being passed by the Supreme Court 66 years ago. This decree that separate but equal is struck down, but there has been no meaningful action on that mandate, right? So you have this broad landscape in 2020 where, again, the school to prison pipeline is alive and well. So many young people, as you were stating, Professor, are not able to access a quality public education just by virtue of where they are and where they were born. And these structures, these barriers continue to exist, in their education and well into their adulthood, leading it to entanglements with the criminal legal system.
Terrific. Thank you very much for that kind of primer. We'll be back. We've got to dig into some of those issues a lot more. Mr. Whitaker, Amir Whitaker, Amir, you're an educator. And you're also an author, of course, a civil rights lawyer. What you also are, though, is a musician. And I do a lot of stuff with my students about art and justice. We think long and hard about it. I think a lot of what's going to get us free is our art, but can you talk about what education justice means to you? How is the fight for equal and complete arts and cultural education intertwined with the continued struggle for freedom from oppression and inequality, freedom from inequality? How are you working to increase access to the arts as a fundamental civil rights issue?
All right, thank you, Professor Armour, for that question. And thank you, everyone, for creating the space and inviting us today for this conversation. As was just shared by Brother Andrew, this country is kind of built on systematic inequality in our educational system. And one of the ways that continues today, one of the many ways that continues today, is through access to arts education. So, Professor Armour, we're in this great state of California, as you know, to get into one of the university systems, our state university system here, you actually need to complete what they call the A through G requirements in high school, which one of those letters includes an arts course. However, there are lots of students, tens of thousands of students that are at schools that actually don't provide that opportunity or don't provide enough opportunity to the arts. So what that is systematic racism, right? If you cannot attend a college, or you're less qualified or less of a greater candidate to attend college because of your zip code, because of the schooling, your community, then that is a systematic inequality. The same way my grandparents were forced to attend segregated schools because of their race. So although it's not on the books, although we have this Brown versus Board decision, right, that says, there's no separate and unequal, right? We see through the resources, through the perpetuation of this system, that continues on. And here in California, actually, I want to do a screen share at the moment to share a fact sheet that we're preparing for this that will be released soon. But it just shows how far behind we are in California compared to many other states. So this is our Arts Justice fact sheet, which it'll be released soon. And I'm going to share a petition link that will have it. But here you can see percentage of students enrolled in arts by state. And in California, we just have 39% of our students enrolled in arts education, compared to, in Arizona, it's nearly 70%. Even in North Carolina, it's 75%. So in California, we're really far behind most of the country, but not just that. If you see this first statistic here, just 64% of majority Black schools have a music teacher compared to 94% of majority white schools. And you see it's with English learners as well. English learners are 20% of California students, but just 5% of students in arts courses. And this chart here talks more about that, how, you know, high school is about 53% of students, or half of students have access to an arts course, which again, that should actually be 100% of students, especially since they need it for college. But in special education schools, just 4% of students. In juvenile court schools, or, you know, in juvenile jails, juvenile prison, it's just 16% of students. And these students are entitled to the same level of education, the same level of rights as students in traditional high schools, but their rights are being violated. And it's not just that, but many districts like LAUSD, as it says here, spends twice as much on education, twice as much on school police than arts education. And I have another chart here that I want to show before I end the screen share, because it demonstrates this. This is like a new phenomena. This chart shows back in 2008, before the recession, you know, LAUSD, which Los Angeles Unified School District, was spending almost $80 million a year on arts and just 51 million a year on school police. But that has since reversed. You know, after the recession, every funding for in all areas dropped, right? But we see here what's going back up is the funding for school police, which was actually at about 80 million until we got a recent victory this summer to reduce it by 25 million. But it's still twice as much as arts education, which is still just at 30 million. So this is showing that school district officials and policymakers themselves are deprioritizing the arts and prioritizing criminalization. This is just throughout LA County here. You see we have over 470 police in LAUSD. But when it comes to nurses, it's just 400, and even dance teachers, we just have 40 dance teachers. So there are literally 10 times as many police in schools than dance teachers. And, you know, that comes from a lack of prioritization from policymakers and a lack of acknowledgement of the impact of arts, because we know there's this achievement gap, right? Or we call it an opportunity gap between students, low-income background students of color, Black students compared to white students. But we also know that there's an art opportunity gap, right? And since the research shows students that are in art classes have higher achievement, higher attendance, higher graduation rates, higher, just a lot of academic outcomes are increased with arts education. When we give it to white students while not giving it to students of color, then we actually exacerbate that achievement gap and continue this long-standing tradition of inequality. Just one last screen share I wanted to share before, because it's a petition that you can sign, because one of the questions asked about what are we doing to change this. So we have a petition here. It's action.aclu.org/ca-care-not-cops, but I'll drop it in the chat box as well. But this is from our students who are demanding that state officials, whether it's the governor, the state superintendent, and others, prioritize and support counselors and the arts, not cops and arrests. And I encourage you to read this because it talks about how California is 48th in the nation when it comes to counselors in schools. 10,000 schools in California, just 2,500 school nurses, and just other statistics that show that our leaders really have a lot to do with reversing the tide. So I'm going to drop that link as well and encourage you all to sign that and join us in this movement.
Thank you. That's powerful and close to my heart. I played the trumpet from 4th grade on, and it sure kept me out of trouble a lot of times and kept me focused, helped me concentrate. Learning to read sheet music, you know, abstract symbols, all kinds of things are great from a pedagogical standpoint. I'm thinking now as a teacher, you know, and so that's invaluable. And I'll just throw one real quick other comment in here, just because too long ago, I was in Poland. And, you know, we really lionize certain kinds of artists as having a certain kind of genius, Beethoven, Mozart, etc. We say, oh, that's genius for sure, right? Not so much when it comes to Black art, you know, and, you know, we have best-selling books out by people like Charles Murray and Herrnstein, The Bell Curve, saying Blacks are genetically dumber, inferior, right? Yet when I was over in Poland, one of the things I noticed was, when my brother and I went around to look at some of the clubs in Warsaw and Gdansk and Krakow and just see what was happening in the scene. When you go into clubs, you think you were up on Sunset in Warsaw, right? It's hip hop, hip hop, hip hop. And then when you go down to Krakow, kind of the higher culture area, it's jazz, jazz, jazz. They have a big 18-foot, statue of Louis Armstrong sitting outside of one club. This Black cultural, genius expressing itself through the arts, right? It's one of the ways the world has come to recognize the genius of Black people in spite of all the books to the contrary, in spite of all the other stuff to the contrary. And so to take that from us is almost like taking our tongues from us, taking one of our expressive tools that we've used to declare our equality from us.
Exactly. Art is culture, and to suppress our culture or limit our access to culture is cultural genocide. And for white students to have more access to jazz education in their school than Black students, even though it came from our ancestors, is really just a travesty of injustice. But yeah, thank you, Professor Armour, for all you do. I'm admiring the art in your house. And I remember actually we had a student art gallery at your place. So thank you for hosting us and all you do to support liberation through the arts and through advocacy.
Thank you, brother. I appreciate that. And at some point I'll talk about my dad, but not now, and that connection. Krithika Santhanam. Let's get down into you are education justice work. You've done a lot of education justice work at the Advancement Project. And it's been addressing largely policing and ending the school to prison pipeline. How did you find yourself on this path as an education justice advocate, number one? Then number two, can you talk about the national movement to divest from policing in schools and use those funds to support student health, wellness, and access to the arts? Why is it important for the education justice movement to be community-centered and led by youth? And finally, what's next for this movement?
Wow, so quite a lot of incredible questions there. I want to start off again by just echoing a big thank you for being invited to speak on this panel. This is such an important series. So yeah, to give a little bit of context on my path to being an education justice advocate, I took a 4-year break between undergrad and law school. And during that time, I worked at a nonprofit organization in Boyle Heights, doing youth development work and building up the leadership capacity and organizing power of young people living in and around the Ramona Gardens public housing development community. And during those years, the high school dropout rate in Boyle Heights was hovering at around 65%. And my kids were dealing with a whole host of systemic issues, from a lack of a safe passage to and from school, right? And as a result, having to cross rival gang territory, to underfunded school facilities, overcrowded classrooms, and really just abysmal public school instruction. Unfortunately, there were a lot of teachers and school administrators who had written off these young people that I was working with and would tell them on an ongoing basis that they were headed on the road to being a part of that 65% statistic. So there was just such a disconnect between, to your point earlier, Professor Armour, me opining to them, right, every day about the value of education and the quality of education that they were actually receiving in their schools. And then the other component of this, of course, is that these young people were brilliant. And while they were being written off by their schools and subjected to this constant negative feedback loop, after school with me, they were learning critical race theory. They were developing an analysis of systemic racism, and they were coming up with these incredible policy solutions and organizing demands to address the issues in their community. So my experience working with them really cemented my desire to be an education justice advocate. And my passion and interests always lied at the intersection of race and our criminal legal system, but particularly how youth of color are criminalized. And education justice is inextricably linked to ending the criminalization of our Black and brown young people. So fast forward to the incredible work that I now get to do at Advancement Project on our Ending the Schoolhouse to Jailhouse Track project. For the last several years, our work has focused on this national campaign to end school policing. And I want to be clear what I mean when I say end school policing, because it's so far beyond just the physical removal of cops from schools. And I know that they are termed school resource officers, but when violence is the only resource you're providing, it is not in fact a resource. And so a cop is a cop is a cop, whether that's out in the streets or in these schools. But what we say when we mean, the end of school policing is not just the physical removal of police presence from schools, but actually dismantling school policing infrastructure, right? And that runs the gamut from removing metal detectors, abolishing surveillance policies, and just ending this overwhelming reliance that Andrew referred to earlier on policing really being used as a proxy for school discipline. And so in 2018, we, in collaboration with our partners, released an incredible report titled We Came to Learn that I highly encourage everyone to check out. And it chronicles the origins of school policing, and it breaks down a lot of common myths around the presence of police in schools. And so what we know from the research and the work that we've done is that school policing actually began as a response to suppress Black and Brown-led student movements for racial and education justice. It was never about safety. It's still not about safety. And people mistakenly make the association that school policing was a response to mass school shootings. But what we know is that since the first and arguably most famous school shooting in 1999 at Columbine, there have been over 200 school shootings that school police have failed to prevent or deter. And the other thing that I want to share, because every time I see this statistic, it's just astounding, but since 1999, the total investment made by the federal and state governments in school police officers is $2 billion. And so we've created a situation where we have 1.7 million students who attend schools with police but no counselors, 3 million students attend schools with police but no nurses, 6 million students attend schools with police but no school psychologists. And I really urge everyone to take a critical lens to our approach to safety, to crime and safety in this country, because a lot of what we're seeing in the community is mirrored on school campuses. And one of the fundamental issues is that our approach is so reactionary instead of being preventative. And so investing those same billions of dollars, right, and having counselors, nurses, mental health workers, violence interrupters, arts education, the list goes on and on, would drastically transform the public school landscape, but it would actually create the kind of safe, nurturing, supportive environments that our students deserve. And, this fight has really been led by incredible young people and youth organizing. And again, these are the people who are best positioned to address the issues, to identify solutions, because they're sitting in school for 8 hours a day and they know what it's like to walk through a metal detector at the start, right? You walk on a school campus, the first thing you're greeted with is a metal detector and a search of your backpack. Already it starts to feel like a jail, right? Or a carceral facility. So it's really, really important that the youth voice is preserved and not co-opted, even by well-intentioned adults who may want to be allies in the fight. But you really need to understand that your role is to really be supporting this movement, not leading it.
Terrific. Let me launch into a few more questions that anyone can dive in on. I'll start with, what do you think parents can do to ensure education justice for their children? What advice would you give to a parent who sought to do that? And we'll start right back at the top and go around.
For sure. Well, Professor Armour, this makes me think about your question, is education worth it on this path to liberation? And I would say yes. I was just thinking about this Kwame Ture clip that I saw on Twitter, where he was talking about his organizing in Lowndes County, Alabama. He's like, look, I was a young man. I was organizing my people. The vote was a tool to advance that organizing strategy, right? But it was not the end all be all, right? And I think similarly with education justice and organizing around it, it is that critical organizing tool, an intergenerational one at that connects folks, not even with their living ancestors and living ascendants, but their ancestors who came before them. I think about a fight that was waged by local advocates in Austin last fall. Like so many schools across the country, a set of Black and Latinx schools were set for closure by the Austin Independent School District Board of Trustees. And it mirrors, this effort to just eviscerate public education and to use these business terms to argue that schools are underperforming and are not operating at efficient capacity, as if a school is a business. And the Austin American-Statesman did some really good investigative journalism into some of the schools, particularly Sims Elementary School in Austin. And it's like, this is an intergenerational community where Black and Latinx people have gone. And it makes me think about Dr. Eva Ewing at the University of Chicago and her wonderful work around education, justice, and sociology. It's like schools are this source of great pride among people in the community and among families. And it's this thing that you can look back to and say that my parents went here, let's say in the 70s, my grandparents went here in the 50s, right? And something that connects you with your folks more deeply. And so I think that that's something that really informs this work, is something to kind of keep in mind in striving for education justice work, and kind of recognizing that parents, particularly who want to be engaged in this fight, are engaged in the Black radical tradition by existing and parenting Black children in the United States in 2020, right? You have been through so much to get to this point, to be a Black parent and to be fighting tooth and nail to keep the carceral system out of your home, to keep your children being snatched away from you because of the state's overreach. And just kind of walking in that power and realizing that that power does exist and that you have the ability to push school districts and principals and teachers to really honor an anti-racist curriculum and ensure that the young people in their schools are receiving the full extent of education services that they deserve.
Great. I'm going to go over to Amir, and this is really kind of an open-ended question. If you any other things that you want to address that we have, and it's open-ended, but I'll kind of just start with the parental connection. Can I, as a parent, for example, if the school isn't providing, say, music education, should I, team up with other parents and try to find some outside the school avenue to do that? Or should I direct my energy at trying to change to the school administration and try to get them to provide so that I don't have to go outside?
That's a great question. And California parents are empowered both at the school site level. You can get on your school or advocate at your school site council. There should be some PTA, but we know historically that's not always the most accessible for some parents. But parents have the right to advocate what they want to see, in their child's school. They have a right to that. And then at the district level, providing input through what's normally called the LCAP process, or the local control and accountability plan. But with the COVID and different things happening now, it's been changed a bit, but there's still a district level way that parents have a right, and school districts and officials have an obligation to listen to parents and students as well. I think we have a really great example of something that happened like that. We had a student who she's at a school. She wants to be an artist. She wants to apply to art school. She wants to be a cartoonist. She's had this dream ever since she was little, yet her school provides no visual art opportunity. And she's in South Central LA. The student's name Alicia, shout out to Alicia. But she went to her friends and started a petition on Instagram, got over 100 signatures in 3 days, took it back to her principal, and her principal knew, that they were violating the students' rights. They knew the students had a right to this education. So they provided an opportunity immediately, started doing some after school stuff and partnering with colleges. So that is a codified right that parents have, that students have, but rights are only as good as our awareness of them and our demand of them, right? Like, I've had my rights violated so many times. It's just, most of us have, right? So it's if you don't have awareness that you, one, have that right, and then two, that you have that power to speak up about it, then unfortunately it gets lost.
Great. And Krithika, same to you. Especially if we're talking about, kind of grassroots organizing, that's a lot of times the parents, right? That we're talking about what kind of role can they play in this whole process?
Yeah, I mean, I think Andrew and Amir already kind of outlined some great points, but one of the things that I always sit with a lot is the sort of additional burden, right, that communities of color have to contend with, one, in dealing with the brunt of oppression, but then in also having to kind of organize and fight back. And so I think one of the things that we've seen that's a practice that is rooted in organizing tradition, but we've really seen lifted up during this COVID pandemic is mutual aid. And I think that figuring out a way to get parents involved, right? But making it so that if you're coming to this Know Your Rights workshop, that you're also kind of getting something out of it, and maybe you're getting connected to a housing attorney who can look at, the eviction issue that you're currently facing, or you're getting connected to services to access benefits, right? Giving folks an incentive, because at the end of the day, of course, like every parent wants to see their child succeed. Every parent wants the whole world of opportunities available, for their kids. But I know when I was organizing young people in Ramona Gardens, a big part of the way we got community moms to turn out was not only providing political education and giving them that analysis of why it was so important to get involved in the fight, but also providing meaningful resources so that that by coming to this meeting today to talk about how the schools are failing your kids, you're also walking away with more resources that hopefully can then lessen kind of some of the daily burdens you're contending with because of poverty, because of systemic racism, because of white supremacy, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's really important to sort of link organizing and mutual aid as much as possible.
Great. The two other issues that I'm going to want us to address in some kind of way, and I'm going to put them both on the table so you can, I'll try to go in some kind of order, but in case we run shy on time. One, COVID, its impact, on the whole education experience and how that may be, the racial justice implications of that, and privatization, the whole privatization debate. All right, so Andrew, we're going to keep the order going that we started with. No, actually, let's mix it up a little. I'm going to go to Amir and then Krithika and then Andrew, just to mix it up. So Amir, either one, COVID or privatization, either one, run with it.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, COVID has changed the way we do everything, and it's literally traumatized almost, a lot of people have trauma from it, but specifically young people. We did a survey, our students led a survey with over 600 students all across the state, and found that actually because of COVID, there's the need for mental health services and support in school for counselors and social workers has actually doubled. Then our students did another survey that looked at the impact of the uprisings and really the injustices against, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and how that's impacted them. And they found that actually just had just as much of an impact on their mental state, on their emotional state, like the injustices. So COVID's created a new world where we now have, kindergartners, instead of being greeted by teachers and, the hugs and the smiles and the snacks and the nap time, they're staring at a computer screen. And we're seeing all sorts of stuff with the criminalization of students. Like we had one student who had a school issued device, a laptop that the school provided, because there's a huge digital divide. That's a major issue with COVID. Like a lot of students just don't have internet or devices, but the school gave this one student a device, and knucklehead was just playing the game on the device, and the cops showed up to his house. Think about that. Like when the police show up because you're playing a game on your school issued computer, or another instance where there was a BB gun in the student's background, and problems came up, and then we're hearing parents at home hearing the instruction are actually hearing how unjust sometimes the education could be. So COVID's changed a lot, and we've seen some leadership from legislators and school districts to respond to it, but we need more funds. And it's really unfortunate at the federal level, that deadlock that happened with the stimulus package, because that would have literally saved jobs and helped students and services, but the political battle has changed. But we really need to change the way we view things in this post-COVID world. When schools open back up, there should be no police at the front door, right? Because that's another triggering thing. And then with the privatization, I think there's definitely a relationship, because you're seeing a lot of students withdraw from traditional public schools. And the privatization argument is wide to, you know, some consider like charter schools as part of that. Some consider just the more traditional private, you know, religious schools. But the fact of the matter is that, especially here in California, there are less students in traditional public schools, and that's impacting the funding scheme as well and creating even more struggles.
Wow. Okay, terrific. Krithika, I'm gonna pass it over to you now. This is such a great panel for me to sit on because I just get to sit and soak it all up. I don't have to do anything. Y'all are doing such a great job. Yeah, let's keep the ball rolling, Krithika.
Yeah, I mean, Amir already touched on, I think, you know, so many of the issues that we're seeing with the digital divide, with the continued criminalization of our Black and brown young people, as he referenced the sort of BB gun incident, I think, which happened in Louisiana. But, you know, a lot of young people also have historically relied on school to get access to food, right? And access to free lunches, which I think there's been somewhat of an effort to still provide during this pandemic, but obviously not nearly as robust as when school was in session. But then the other thing to really consider is, you know, people say we don't know what the health impacts of COVID are gonna be, and it's, you know, still, you know, to be seen. And when health impacts, like Amir mentioned, I also think of mental health impacts, right? I cannot imagine being a young person and having to do 8 hours of schooling every day on Zoom. And then, you know, if assuming that we are in a place where we can safely reopen schools again, to go back to a school where, you know, you don't have a nurse, you don't have a counselor, you don't have a school psychologist, you don't have anyone to really help you as a resource deal with the trauma of this pandemic, which you know you will have, you know, is the same sort of policing infrastructure that views you as a threat. And so I think, you know, it's an opportunity that this pandemic really is, it's been a reckoning that has been, you know, hundreds of years in the making, but it's an opportunity to really think about how we do things and whether these existing frameworks are working and who they're working for. I mean, I think when we think about, you know, education justice, to me, part of that is also having a liberatory education system, is having an education curriculum that is not Eurocentric, where, you know, what you're learning is to venerate people like Columbus and Washington as these sort of great heroes and icons, right? So all of that is really important to consider. And right now, I think our big push is that, you know, the money that is being divested away from school police budgets really needs to be reinvested and reallocated towards these critical resources and supports. Whether, you know, whether school districts are actually going to do that, again, is going to hinge on how much power we can build on the ground amongst young people, parents, and allies. And then I think, you know, the privatization conversation is interesting, right? Because I think, like, when did knowledge become a commodity? Can someone please explain to me why it's a commodity and why access to education is dependent on where I live, right? Which, or what zip code I was born into, which is something I have no control over. And so, you know, the privatization scheme, again, is just a reflection of these sort of same neoliberal type policies that are all about further retrenching kind of the, you know, social welfare state. And it's really unfortunate because, as Amir mentioned, it's really, you know, drowning out the funding that should otherwise exist. And of course, we know with all of these issues that the most impacted groups are going to be Black and brown students, students with disabilities, you know, differently abled students, LGBTQ students. So we know that the most marginalized of our young people are going to be dealing with the brunt of all of this. And so now really is the time for radical transformation and really to, like, keep our foot on the gas.
All right, great. Andrew, you're going to get to bring us home on this particular question, but I'm going to ask, I'm going to add this wrinkle, and Krithika and Amir, if you want to weigh back in later after Andrew has had a chance to share some with us, you're welcome to. But talk to me as a parent who is thinking about putting their kid in a private or a public school.
Yeah.
And I, you know, have 3 sons. They're all millennials now, you know, all got them all through and over that hump, you know, and all of that. But I said to myself, you know, back in the day when they were, you know, little youngins, I said, I got to walk the walk. I can't just talk the talk. So I started them out in private school over in Santa Monica, PS1, you know, they were doing all the things that they do, you know, like open learning environment, all that. Then I put them in a public school, I'm not gonna say which one, near here, for grade school. In 2 years, I went in as a parent for 2 years, went in, I said, you know, talked to the teachers, tried to, you know, I'm an educator too, tried to talk to. What I saw was the incentive structure of the teachers was to teach to the bottom half of the class. Once you got to the mean, they didn't get credit if you were at the 90% and they took you to 95%, you know, percentile in something, you know, in some comprehension, understanding of some subject. Their incentives were to bring up the bottom half. So you know, when I finally took them out after 2 years, put them back in private school, it took them 2 years to catch back up to the other students. Took them 2 years to catch back up. And, you know, but talk to me, you know, on the other hand, I still feel conflicted because I'm part of the problem too now. I am, you know, I contributed to it. So I just want to put that out there. That's almost my confessional. I had to confess today for some reason. I had to get that off my chest. But what do you say, Andrew, to some parents like me?
Yeah. So I'm 29 and I spent my 2nd through 6th grade years at parochial school in St. Louis when my parents, sister, and I lived there. And I'm trying to think all these years later, some 20 years later, of if that contributed to the radicalization or if that was some type of hindrance, like if I would have come into my politics sooner, but for Catholic school. You know, regardless of it, I'm glad of where I've landed. I think it's a really tricky balance for folks, right? I don't want to minimize the really difficult choices that are placed in front of parents in the United States in 2020 when it relates to their children's education. You know, you see this evisceration, and there's been this bipartisan approval of it, right? As Krithika mentioned, neoliberalism and these ideas of race to the top, and like folks like Rahm Emanuel who were shuttering, you know, scores of schools in Chicago public schools in 2014, which is the subject of that Eve Ewing book that I mentioned, Goes to the Schoolyard. But yeah, you've gotten to this point in 2020 where it is like, what do I do, right? Especially with this pandemic, if I work in an hourly wage job and I have no options but to send my children to schools, whether they be religious private schools, private charter schools that are open and are giving me a place to have my child 8 hours a day where I can work and not worry about childcare. You know, what do? I would say as earnestly as possible to all the sentiments echoed, especially Karithika's about mutual aid, try to lean into that community as much as possible. To those folks in your neighborhood who are similarly situated, going through these various difficulties that we're all facing in this moment, to say, like, let's build up our mutual aid network to the extent that we can. Let's try to support the public school within our district, send our children. If it is a hybrid learning situation, let's try to do that the best we can. If folks have rotating schedules, the children can kind of pod in the pandemic and, you know, be at one person's house where they can receive their virtual instruction. But yeah, just kind of recognize that, you know, this has been a long-standing battle against public goods and the welfare benefits and the welfare state, right? Any type of social net has been the target of evisceration for decades, right? And I think public education is that last tangible public good that folks, you know, feel very compassionate about and very drawn to. And so to the extent that you are able to collaborate with your network and ensure that your children can go to public schools and you kind of build up their liberatory education model with the supplements that you provide to them, I think that's the best thing. Recognizing that I'm privileged as a non-parent and as this person from my, you know, ivory tower of the nonprofit industrial complex.
No, that's spot on. I wouldn't devalue anything you said by that, because that was spot on. You are replicating the kind of tortured process I was going through, and it was very effectively all the nuance and everything else. No, I really appreciate that. Now, from an advocacy standpoint, what efficacy in advocacy, right? What are some strategies that we can employ that are most efficacious in moving the needle on educational matters? Should we focus our energies on litigation? Is litigation the way, or should we prioritize our efforts in a way that they're going to go to other targeted areas, or is there some mix? So this time we'll start with Krithika and go on around to Andrew and wrap up with Amir. Krithika?
Yeah, so I think the litigation versus non-litigation strategies is a really interesting question. One of the things that I love about Advancement Project is I always say we're not an impact litigation shop. It's not what we do. We strategically file litigation when we feel that it is going to help build power on the ground, when we feel that it is going to help an existing local campaign that's being led by directly impacted folks. I think in my years out of law school, have become increasingly more cynical about the efficacy, right, of litigation and lawsuits, and definitely know now, as much as for anyone who's currently in law school positions you to believe that the courts will save us, they absolutely will not save us, and we must, save ourselves. But I think that, cases like, Brown v. Board is an interesting example, right? And I don't want to diminish the significance of that case, but I also don't want to overstate the importance of the impact it actually had on our public education landscape. We've had a very troubled history since Brown, and as Andrew said, did it in fact actually desegregate our public schools? If you were to ask me, I would say no. And so I think as much as you can employ litigation as sort of a multi-pronged strategy, again, really in service of building local power on the ground, absolutely. I think there are some really creative, reasons to continue to litigate. I mean, education is still apparently not a constitutional right. Poverty is not a suspect classification, right? So there are some creative litigation strategies that can be employed to kind of change these things. But I am very, like I said, skeptical of kind of the trickle-down effect and how much that win in the courtroom actually materially changes the day-to-day lives of the young people that we see most impacted by these systems and policies. So to me, I think my kind of thumb on the scale is always going to lean towards organizing and building power on the ground.
Hard truths to tell a law professor, but real. That is, hey, I'm telling you, that's just the truth. At the very least, I would say this. The law school is a great whetstone for sharpening your analytic skills and doing whatever you want with it after that. And that's like a great reason, I think, to go to law school. You're going to come out not only with a global sense of how society is organized and run on a legal level, but with some really sharp analytical skills and some pretty decent writing skills too. But I'm not going to sell it on go to law school and laws will save us. The courts will save us. I hate to say that, but I have to. You got me. Andrew?
Yeah. So one of the reasons I admire Krithika and Amir so much, not only as my friends, but just like the way that they have structured their careers as movement lawyers, right? And I think especially Advancement Project, where I spent just under 2 years of my career, has done a good job of instilling in me, and where Krithika and her colleagues are employing it right now, is being in community with base building organizations across the country and being in authentic partnership with folks, right? Seeing it with Amir and his collaboration with young people and doing the DOPE's push for arts education and art justice and education justice. I think that has to be critical, right? I am similarly skeptical about litigation as a strategy, especially within the education justice space, for all the reasons, right? It's costly, it takes away that attention from local base building efforts, right? It can be kind of years in the making, which is a real injustice in education justice work, because the clock is fast ticking as you're trying to secure these remedies for young people who are growing up as you're seeking them. And so, yeah, I think that if you, in connection with the base building organization, are able to identify a strategic litigation opportunity that does support existing work and the movement, let's say, for ending school policing by highlighting a very heinous, like 1983 violation that occurred on a school campus, then go for it. But yeah, I would very much so advise, like Krithika, to not think about litigation as that first step in trying to seek relief.
All right, school boards, folks, do they have a special role in either dismantling or perpetuating systemic racism in the public schools? School boards, how should we go with there? And I guess this time we're back to you, and well, Andrew, you just spoke, so we'll go to Amir. We'll wind up on you this time. Next, start with you, Amir.
School boards, they have, I'm trying to think of the way you framed it, because it's, what role do they have? They have not just a role, but an obligation under law. So, you know, they are public officials, especially there are lots of hooks, whether it's them receiving federal funds, whether it's their obligation to students with disabilities. And in California, we have extra obligations here as well. But I did wanted to say one thing, just to add on to what, you know, folks said about litigation, because it is important. It draws an important line in the sand, right? So I myself, I'm an organizer, you know, I'm a researcher and a lawyer, so I'm other things. And so I don't just view litigation as that, because we have to sue school boards too. But there's also power in going to school board meetings and different things like that. But litigation is an important tool, because like I'm with the ACLU, right? And we've sued the Trump administration or filed over 400 legal actions against his administration, to whether it's to stop the border wall or to protect the census, to protect DACA. It's just like, if we didn't pursue litigation, it wouldn't, you know, who knows what would have happened. But also I want to do a quick screen share, because it relates to the school board meeting, and also relates to our hairstyles, Professor Armour, because here's a school board meeting I went to, and I'm holding a pick in my hand, and I like to say Exhibit A, because the school district had a policy that actually confiscated hair picks. And I took this there as well. There are students that go to school and get quote unquote randomly searched, and they confiscate their hair picks. You see they're taking permanent markers, scissors, and different things. In ACLU, we actually sued LAUSD related to this policy early in the 90s, but we didn't get the victory until we were organizing with students. Students Deserve, Black Lives Matter. So this is a victory picture where we got the end to that policy, but this was the school board. So this was a very discriminatory policy where Black students were saying, hey, I can't literally take a tool for my hair, right? And we were able to dismantle it, but the school board has an obligation to ensure policies like that do not discriminate.
Yeah, you know, wow. We have the Crown Act now in California, right? Which protects you in the workplace, at least, against discrimination. And I'm not sure how far it extends to, if it extends to schools. You may know more than I should have looked at because when I've had a comment on it, it's always been private employers and their employee-employer relationship. Man, right. I should know that. But if the principle, at least, of the Crown Act, the spirit of it, is that it's important for people, for lots of reasons, to not try to police a follicle fashion. And that actually hair can not only be about just appearance, it can also be about politics. You know, right. I used to wear it in in high school, back in high school, because I went from 6'5" to 6'8" on the basketball court. It just made me look bigger. But you know, it was smoke and mirrors. Then I started writing on sabbatical, writing this article. And, you know, I was trimmed. I looked like Obama. I wasn't thinking about follicle fashion. But then I missed 9 months of trips to Here Architects, the barbershop around the corner, went back to school and overheard some of the students say it was ironic that Professor Armour teaches criminal law while he looks like a criminal. And some downtown attorneys called back and told my colleagues when I did a presentation for them that my appearance was impertinent and unprofessional. And wow. That's when I was able to say, grow, baby, grow. But then it turned into a political expression, right? Now we're talking free speech. Now we're talking a bat signal of solidarity to Black Lives Matter. All right. And so there's so many issues intertwined with that.
And thank you for doing that. And because me seeing you with your afro just made me keep my afro too, because I had law professors, judges, and others say if you wanted to be taken seriously, cut your hair, but why are they policing our bodies, right? And this is how our hair naturally grows. So just thank you for being that living, beautiful, radical example, Professor Armour.
Brother, I appreciate it. Thank you. Celebration of the African-American soul. Krithika. Yes, I think we were going around. You're bringing us home on the question of school boards. You know, are they an acupressure point that we should be focusing energy on? How should we approach them?
Absolutely, absolutely. And in so many places where, you know, these are elected seats. And again, it highlights the power of local elections, right? Being able to make it clear that they will be voted out if they continue to perpetuate systemic racism through a variety of policies. But at least what we've seen, the kind of single most impactful policy that they coalesce around is like the presence of police in schools. So I think, you know, one of the things that you opened with when we started this is kind of this question looming in the background of, does your vote really matter? Does my vote really matter? And there is a little bit of a disconnect, I think, you know, outside of next week. In the past, probably people have been like, well, presidential elections, again, don't have a material impact on my day-to-day life. Regardless of who's in the highest office in the land, that doesn't change my day-to-day. But local elections actually can, right? And local elections are the easiest way to sort of get involved, get informed, and again, you know, get parents and young people together to sort of organize and lay out demands. And what we've seen in the wins that we've seen, you know, since this pandemic started, with school districts either voting to end their contracts with school police or disband, like we saw in Oakland, their internal school police department, or the incredible win in LA with Students Deserve, like that came on the heels of pressure being placed on school board members, right? And so absolutely, it is a huge pressure point that needs to be utilized.
Great, folks. You know, time's winged a chariot, keeps moving. So we're at the end of our time together. I'm going to give each of you a few moments to give us your closing thoughts on this subject of educational justice in this, in this moment of generational upheaval, unlike any other before it. And I'll start with Amir. We'll go around to Krithika and wind up with you, Andrew. All right, Amir?
Cool, thank you. Thanks, Professor Armour. Thanks everyone for tuning into this conversation. I think in this moment of uprising, global uprising, an examination of these systems, understanding that our educational system was built on inequality, right? My grandparents went to school, segregated schools. My mentor graduated my law school in the 70s, and he was the third Black person to graduate my law school at the University of Miami, because these institutions were created to keep people out and elevate others. Considering that, we need to reevaluate them radically and really rethink how we are treating students. Everything from even how a classroom is set up in the really industrial revolution way, right? Like most indigenous cultures had more of a circle, right? Just because of the power dynamic, but we really need to think that radically and just understand this system wasn't created for everyone, so we can dismantle it or re-envision it. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah, beautifully said. And again, want to thank ACS for inviting me to speak on this panel. This was such a treat. Amir and Andrew are doing incredible work. It's an honor to be on this panel with y'all. I think there are still ongoing and active fights. It's been great to see the wins that we have seen, but there are places like Philly and Chicago and DC and even LA, right, where the fight is ongoing to divest from school policing and invest in the resources that students need. And so I just encourage folks to really get involved in those fights and think about what your contribution can be, whether it's just having a conversation and busting some of those myths that I shared earlier around the need for school policing or the origins of school policing and the impact of school policing, but also figuring out, whether it's a petition that you're going to sign, or as an attorney, if you're going to do like a Know Your Rights workshop, kind of what can be your contribution, because like I said, regardless of the outcome next week, regardless of wins in certain places, like the fight continues. We can't take our foot off the gas. And it's going to take all of us really to dismantle, structural racism in our schools and really create the type of liberatory education that our young people deserve. And so, it starts with each and every one of us. So just figure out how you can get involved in the fight and how you can really support and uplift young people who are leading the fight. And thanks so much for tuning into this conversation today.
Could not agree anymore. I'm so thankful to ACS for this conversation and this opportunity to hold space with such incredible lawyers and advocates and friends. So grateful to Professor Armour, Amir, and Krithika. I think that as we register the loss that we have suffered this year, part that was inevitable because of the racial capitalism that has sustained the United States and the white supremacy that has fueled this nation since the beginning. Still, we must be reminded of a quote that I hold near and dear to my heart of a prison industrial complex abolitionist that I admire, Mariam Kaba, that hope is a discipline. We have been through a lot. We're closing in on 250,000 people lost to the coronavirus pandemic. We have so many things moving toward the end of this year, right, and shifts in power. So please do be reminded that hope is a discipline. It's something that is applied and practiced each day. And that, especially for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, you fit squarely within that radical tradition of existing in this nation and letting that existence be your resistance, right? And just figuring out ways to continually dig into community in this time and to uplift the efforts of community to provide the, again, liberatory education model, the social services that the government has abdicated its responsibility to deliver to us, and really provide that future for the generations that are young among us and the generations that are yet to be born. I'm so grateful for this conversation. Thank you all.
Perfect, great. I'm going to turn the reins over to our to ACS folk. Gabriella Barbosa.
Thank you so much, Professor Armour, and thank you to each one of our panelists, Krithika, Andrew, and Amir. This was such an amazing conversation. There were a couple questions that we didn't get to, but we will send out some resources in an email to all of our attendees, including all of these incredible papers and resources that our folks, panelists mentioned. I also wanted to plug in our next racial justice and the law panel that will be focused on housing. That will take place on November 12th at 12 p.m. and we will also send out information on that as well. So that concludes our event today. Thank you again to everyone. It was such an amazing conversation. Thank you for giving us hope in this movement. Take care, everyone.